The conquest of America was one of the most transcendental episodes in universal history, an encounter between two worlds that forever transformed the destiny of humanity. The Genoese navigator Christopher Columbus proposed a revolutionary idea: to reach the Indies by sailing westward, crossing the unknown Atlantic Ocean. After years of rejection in various European courts, Columbus obtained the support of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, who saw in his project a strategic and spiritual opportunity. In 1492, with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, he departed from the port of Palos de la Frontera on an expedition that would change the course of the world. On October 12th of that year, Columbus and his crew sighted land. They had reached the American continent, although he believed until his death that he had reached the eastern coasts of Asia. That discovery marked the beginning of the conquest and colonization of the New World. Spain became the most powerful nation on the planet, spreading its language, faith, and culture throughout the continent. The voyages of Christopher Columbus and the encounter of two worlds. In the 15th century, Europe began to emerge from the Middle Ages toward a horizon of discoveries, trade, and imperial ambitions. The traditional routes to the east, dominated by Muslim powers, had become increasingly difficult and expensive. Spices, gold, and silk became symbols of prosperity that European crowns longed to achieve without intermediaries. In this context, a Genoese navigator of uncertain origin and boundless ambition began to imagine an enterprise that would transform human history, reaching Asia by sailing westward. His name was Christopher Columbus. Columbus was born in Genoa around 1451 into a family of weavers. From a young age, he was interested in the sea and trade routes. He sailed the Mediterranean, worked for Genoese merchant houses, and lived for a time in Portugal, where he studied maps, read chronicles, and listened to stories about unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. Portugal was then the vanguard of maritime exploration, and Columbus understood that the oceans were the new stage of power. However, while the Portuguese sought to sail around Africa to reach the East Indies, he conceived a bolder idea: to reach the east by going west. During the 1480s, he presented his project to King John II of Portugal, but it was rejected. Columbus's calculations about the distance to Asia were wrong. He underestimated the size of the planet and believed that Japan was only a few weeks away by sea. When all seemed lost, he moved to Castile and offered his proposal to the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. After long negotiations, and thanks to the support of religious figures such as Friar Juan Perez, he was received again in 1492, the same year that the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada fell and the Reconquista ended. Spain, now unified and victorious, was seeking new horizons. On April 17, 1492, the monarchs signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, granting Columbus the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of the discovered lands, as well as 1/10 of the profits. With 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, and a crew of about 90 men, he set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492. For weeks, the caravels crossed the Atlantic without sighting land. Morale declined, and there were rumors of mutiny. Columbus kept his faith, convinced that he was about to reach Cipango, as Japan was then called. Finally, at dawn on October 12, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana spotted land. They had arrived at an island in the Bahamas archipelago, which Columbus named San Salvador. Believing he was in the Indies, he called its inhabitants Indians. From there, he explored other islands, including Cuba and Hispaniola, marveling at the tropical landscapes, precious metals, and customs of the native peoples. In December of that same year, the Santa Maria ran aground off the coast of Hispaniola, forcing Columbus to leave part of his men in a small fort called La Navidad, the first European settlement in the New World. Convinced of his success, he began his return in January 1493. He arrived in Lisbon on March 4th and later in Barcelona, where he was received with honors by the Catholic monarchs. His name became synonymous with glory. He had opened a door that would never again be closed. The success of the first voyage aroused unprecedented fervor. Spain hastened to organize a second expedition, this time of a colonizing nature. The goal was no longer just to explore, but to populate and exploit the new lands. On September 25, 1493, Columbus sailed from Cadiz in command of 17 ships and more than 1,200 men, including soldiers, artisans, clergymen, and royal officials. They carried seeds, domestic animals, and tools, symbols of a conquest that was no longer spiritual or scientific, but imperial. During this journey, he discovered the Lesser Antilles, including Dominica and Guadeloupe, and finally arrived once again at Hispaniola, where he found the fort of La Navidad destroyed and all his men dead. In its place, he founded a new colony, La Isabela, the first permanent European city in America. However, the dream soon turned into chaos. Tropical diseases, hunger, and lack of discipline triggered conflicts among the colonists. The promises of gold vanished. Columbus, who lacked political skills, faced rebellions and had to impose severe punishments. As the situation worsened, tensions with the native peoples began. The demands for tribute and the desperate search for precious metals led to violent confrontations. The Taíno were forced to work under inhuman conditions, and the system of repartimientos laid the foundations of the future colonial exploitation model. Meanwhile, Columbus continued exploring the coasts of Cuba and Jamaica, convinced he had reached the eastern islands of Asia. His obsession with proving himself right blinded him to the evidence that he was facing an unknown continent. In 1496, he returned to Spain, worn out and sick, yet still hopeful. He presented his reports to the Catholic monarchs, who, although pleased with the territorial expansion, were beginning to doubt his ability to govern. The dream of the Genoese navigator was beginning to crumble under the weight of colonial reality. Despite the difficulties, Columbus managed to organize a third voyage in 1498. This time he departed from Sanlúcar de Barrameda with 6 ships, seeking a more southerly route. It was then that for the first time he reached the American continent, arriving at the mouth of the Orinoco in present-day Venezuela. The immense flow of the river made him suspect he was facing a continental mass, but he interpreted this discovery as the proximity of the earthly paradise described in the scriptures. From there he sailed toward Hispaniola, where he found a colony plunged into anarchy. The settlers accused him of abuse of power, and the monarchs, alarmed by the complaints, sent Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate. Columbus was arrested, chained, and sent back to Spain in 1500. Although Isabella and Ferdinand ordered his release shortly afterward, the myth of the discoverer had begun to crumble. His authority was revoked, and his reputation was tainted by accusations of cruelty and mismanagement. Even so, in 1502, he obtained permission for a fourth and final voyage, aiming to find a passage to Asia. He set sail from Cadiz with 4 ships and explored the coasts of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, facing storms, mutinies, and shipwrecks. For months he endured extreme hardships, stranded in Jamaica and abandoned by the crown. His men fell ill, and Columbus, aged and suffering from gout, realized that his dream had ended. He returned to Spain in November 1504, just after Queen Isabella's death. He spent the last years of his life in Valladolid, trying in vain to recover his titles and wealth. He died on May 20th, 1506, unaware that he had discovered an entire continent. For him, the New World never existed. He died convinced he had reached the East Indies. However, his voyage marked the greatest turning point in modern history. The geography, economy, religion, and identity of the planet would change forever. As the Spanish caravels continued crossing the Atlantic in search of new lands, a name began to echo on the maps of Europe: Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine navigator who understood what Columbus never imagined. The newly discovered lands were not Asia, but a new continent. In the following years, that continent would bear his name, America. Pre-Columbian empires, before the European arrival. Before the Castilian candles cut the Caribbean horizon, America was already a continent full of ancient, refined, and powerful civilizations. For millennia, diverse peoples had built cities, temples, and trade networks that rivaled those of Europe or Asia in complexity. In the high valleys of Mexico, the jungles of Central America, and the Andean peaks of the south, the Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas dominated vast territories, sustained by a political and religious organization that made power a form of worship. When the Europeans arrived, they found empires that had flourished and fallen long before their own history was written. In the heart of the Valley of Mexico stood the Aztec Empire, or Mexica, a people who had migrated from the north in the 13th century, guided by a warrior god named Huitzilopochtli. After centuries of pilgrimage, they settled on an islet in Lake Texcoco, where, according to legend, they saw an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. There they founded their capital, Tenochtitlan, in 1325. From that place they began a military and economic expansion that led them to dominate almost all of central Mesoamerica. Their system was based on strategic alliances and tributes demanded from conquered peoples. The so-called Triple Alliance, formed by Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, made the Aztecs the most formidable power on the continent. Tenochtitlan, built on a series of artificial islands and connected to the mainland by causeways and aqueducts, was an astonishing city. Spanish chroniclers who visited it spoke of markets where tens of thousands of people gathered, of pyramid temples rising to the sky, and of an urban organization that surpassed many European cities of the time. The Templo Maya, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the god of rain, was the spiritual heart of the empire. There, human sacrifices were performed which, beyond the horror they inspired in Europeans, had a deep religious meaning. To maintain cosmic balance and ensure the movement of the sun, the power of the emperor, or Huitlatowani, was absolute. He ruled with military and religious authority, assisted by priests, nobles, and warriors. At the apex of this system was Moctezuma II, who in 1502 inherited a vast and prosperous empire, but one sustained by the oppression of subjugated peoples. That internal resentment would years later be one of the cracks that allowed its downfall. South of the Aztec territory, among the jungles of present-day Yucatan, Guatemala, and Honduras, the last vestiges of another great civilization survived, the Maya. Their peak had occurred many centuries earlier, between the years 250 and 900 CE, when cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Calakmul dominated the Mesoamerican landscape. The Maya had developed a system of hieroglyphic writing, precise astronomical knowledge, and monumental architecture that reflected their vision of the universe. Each city-state was independent and governed by a priestly and warrior elite. Religion permeated every aspect of life: time, rituals, sacrifices, war. Their 365-day calendar, based on the observation of solar and stellar movements, was as accurate as the Gregorian calendar that Europe would adopt centuries later. From the 10th century onwards, the great Maya cities of the classic period collapsed for still debated reasons: internal wars, agricultural exhaustion, prolonged droughts, or overpopulation. However, the Maya legacy did not disappear. Later cities, such as Chichen Itza and Mayapan, continued their cultural tradition, and when the Spaniards arrived in the 16th century, they still found organized and resilient Maya communities deep in the jungle. Their knowledge of the stars, mathematics, and architecture survived the passage of time, inscribed in stone and in codices that the fire of conquest almost completely erased. Beyond the Isthmus of Panama, at the other end of the continent, the Inca Empire rose, a colossus that dominated the Andes mountain range and extended its authority over more than 3,000 kilometers from present-day Ecuador to Chile. Its capital, Cusco, was considered the navel of the world, a sacred center designed according to a geometric and symbolic plan that reflected cosmic order. The Incas had achieved what few civilizations without phonetic writing accomplished, unifying dozens of distinct peoples under an efficient and centralized administration. The figure of the Sapa Inca, descendant of the sun god Inti, embodied both political and spiritual power. His word was law, and his image was venerated as divine. The secret of Inca power lay in their organization. Through the Ailu system, peasant communities shared land and collective labor. The harvests were distributed according to the needs of the state, temples, and towns. Each province was connected to Cusco via a network of roads, the Capac Ñan, which traversed mountains, deserts, and valleys. Along these roads, the Chasquis, messengers who ran long distances, transmitted orders and news using quipus, cords with colored knots that recorded numerical information. In an era without wheels or large pack animals, the Incas managed to articulate an empire as extensive as the Roman one, Their architecture, based on the work of stone blocks perfectly assembled without mortar, reflected impressive technical mastery. Fortresses such as Sacsayhuaman, temples such as the Coricancha, and cities such as Machu Picchu, hidden among mountains, symbolized the power and spirituality of the state. But the splendor of Tahuantinsuyo also hid vulnerabilities. The Inca succession system was not clearly defined, and dynastic disputes often led to civil wars. In the years prior to the arrival of the Europeans, the empire was divided by a conflict between the brothers Huasca and Atahualpa, sons of the late emperor Huayna Capac. That fratricidal war weakened the political and military structures of the Tahuantinsuyo just before Francisco Pizarro's men landed on its coasts. The fate of the last great empire of South America was sealed before a single weapon was fired. Meanwhile, in other regions of the continent, smaller but no less complex civilizations flourished. In what is now Colombia, the Muiscas cultivated gold with extraordinary artistic precision and practiced rituals that would inspire the legend of El Dorado. In the north, the Toltecs had left their mark on the sculptures of Tula and in the mythology of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who centuries later would be remembered by the Aztecs as a deity promising to return from the east. In the plains of northern Argentina, in the deserts of Chile, or in the jungles of the Amazon, hundreds of peoples maintained their own social structures, beliefs, and languages, forming a human mosaic as vast as the continent itself. America, on the eve of European contact, was a full, diverse, and self-sufficient world. From the agricultural terraces of the Andes to the stepped temples of the Mexican highlands, from the sacred cenotes of Yucatan to the networks of exchange that crossed the Caribbean, everything followed a different logic, foreign to the mercantile ambition of Europe. American societies did not need to discover the world. They had inhabited it for thousands of years. And while the sun set over the pyramids of Tenochtitlan and the Quipus of Cusco continued recording the life of a balanced empire, on the other side of the ocean, the kings of Castile and Aragon were preparing to send new expeditions. The time of isolation had ended. The arrival of the conquerors. When news of Christopher Columbus's discoveries spread throughout Europe, the fever of conquest gripped the Iberian kingdoms. Within a few decades, a generation of men hardened by war, driven by faith, ambition, and personal glory, crossed the ocean to claim in the name of the Spanish crown the lands and treasures of the New World. They were soldiers, adventurers, and visionaries, but also opportunists who saw in America a promise of fortune and power. Among them stood out three names that would become synonymous with conquest and tragedy: Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and Pedro de Alvarado. Born in Medellín, Extremadura, in 1485, Hernán Cortés grew up in a family of hidalgos without fortune. He studied law in Salamanca, but soon abandoned his studies to seek opportunities in the New World. In 1504, he traveled to La Española, and years later he participated in the conquest of Cuba, where he gained the trust of Governor Diego Velázquez. Shrewd, charismatic, and ambitious, Cortés was a man who understood that history is written with boldness. In 1518, Velázquez granted him command of an expedition to the continent, though he soon regretted it. Disobeying orders, Cortés set sail on his own on February 10, 1519, with 11 ships, around 500 men, some horses, and a handful of cannons. He landed on the coasts of Veracruz, where he founded a town in the king's name and established the first city council of continental America. That decision sealed his political independence from Cuba. Soon he met a woman who would change the course of history, Malinali Tenepatl, known to the Spaniards as La Malinche. She spoke Nahuatl and Maya and became an interpreter, advisor, and strategic ally. Thanks to her, Cortés established contact with peoples under Mexica rule and forged alliances with enemies of the Aztecs, such as the Tlaxcaltecs. His military genius and ability to exploit internal divisions allowed him to advance to the heart of Mesoamerica's most powerful empire. In November 1519, he arrived in Tenochtitlan, where he was received by Emperor Moctezuma II. What began as a diplomatic encounter turned into a military occupation. Cortés took the emperor prisoner and used his figure as a tool of control. However, the arrival of reinforcements from Cuba under Panfilo de Narváez forced him to temporarily abandon the city. He returned shortly after, but the atmosphere had changed. Violence erupted. In 1520, during a revolt, Moctezuma was killed and the Spaniards were expelled in the so-called Sad Night. Cortés did not surrender. He reorganized his forces, established a prolonged siege, and, with the help of his indigenous allies, conquered the city on August 13, 1521. Tenochtitlan was destroyed, and on its ruins, Mexico City was born, the capital of the new viceroyalty of New Spain. While Cortés consolidated his rule in the north, another Extremaduran, Francisco Pizarro, dreamed of even greater riches. Born in Trujillo around 1478, he was an illegitimate child and illiterate. He served in expeditions in Panama alongside Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the discoverer of the South Sea, the Pacific Ocean. In those lands, he heard of a fabulous kingdom to the south, full of gold and ruled by an all-powerful monarch. Determined to find it, he organized several expeditions between 1524 and 1531, facing hunger, disease, and mutinies. Finally, he reached the coasts of present-day Peru, where he was received by emissaries of the Inca Empire. The golden gifts they offered confirmed his suspicions. He had found the land of legends. With the support of King Charles I and the signing of the Capitulation of Toledo in 1529, Pizarro obtained the right to conquer and govern those lands. He departed from Panama with just over 180 men, 27 horses, and 4 cannons. In 1532, he arrived at Cajamarca, where Emperor Atahualpa was located, recently victorious in a civil war against his brother Huascar. Pizarro invited him to a meeting, feigning respect, but during the meeting, the Spaniards launched an ambush. Thousands of Incas were massacred, and Atahualpa was captured. In exchange for his freedom, the emperor offered to fill a room with gold and silver. He fulfilled his promise but was executed anyway, strangled on July 26, 1533. Pizarro marched toward Cuzco, the sacred capital, and took it without resistance. Over its temples he built churches, and over the solar order of the Tahuantinsuyo he imposed the Christian cross. In 1535 he founded the City of Kings, today Lima, from where he administered his domain. However, greed and rivalries among conquerors soon turned against him. In 1541 he was assassinated in his own house by the supporters of Diego de Almagro, his former partner. His body was left abandoned in the streets of Lima, while the empire he had conquered began to fragment under the administration of the crown. In addition to the infamous legend of their commander, one man among Cortés's men stood out for his ferocity and courage: Pedro de Alvarado, born in Badajoz around 1485. Blonde, light-eyed, and with an impulsive temperament, the indigenous people nicknamed him Tonatiuh, the sun god. He participated in the conquest of Mexico and was one of the most feared captains. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, Cortés sent him to subdue Guatemala and El Salvador. There, Alvarado demonstrated relentless brutality. In 1524, at the Battle of Quetzaltenango, he faced the Quiche led by their lord Tecún Umán, who, according to legend, died facing Alvarado himself in single combat. Alvarado's campaigns extended Spanish rule over much of Central America. He founded the city of Santiago de los Caballeros de Guatemala, which would become the political center of the region. But his ambition knew no bounds. He attempted to participate in the conquest of Peru, although he was rejected by Pizarro. He then embarked on an expedition to Quito, where he died in 1541, crushed by a horse during a military accident. His figure remained marked by the contrast between his courage and cruelty, a symbol of an era in which conquest was intertwined with destruction. In just half a century, the Spanish crown had gone from a handful of uncertain expeditions to controlling an entire continent. The conquerors were rewarded with titles, encomiendas, and fame, but they also left behind a world in ruins and a new society in formation. Pyramids became churches, roads became imperial routes, and the ancient gods were replaced by the crucifix and the sword. America had been conquered, but the cost of that victory was only beginning to be written. The fall of the Aztec Empire. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the Aztec Empire was at the height of its power. From its capital, Tenochtitlan, a city of canals, causeways, and pyramid temples, Emperor Moctezuma II ruled millions of subjects. His armies had subdued almost all the peoples of the Central Valley and the highlands, from Veracruz to Oaxaca, and tributes flowed in endless caravans of gold, jade, cocoa, and quetzal feathers. But that prosperity rested on a precarious balance: the resentment of oppressed peoples, the rigidity of its warrior religion, and blind faith in omens that foretold the end of times. From the east, the winds brought rumors. Fishermen and merchants claimed to have seen floating towers moving over the sea. Moctezuma, uneasy, consulted his priests and astronomers. The omens were grim. Some recalled an ancient prophecy, the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, the Lord of Wisdom, exiled centuries ago, who would come back from the east. When Cortés arrived with his men, the firearms, horses, and shining armor seemed to confirm the prophecy. Moctezuma believed he was facing divine beings. Cortés, on the other hand, understood that the myth could become his greatest ally. The Spanish advance inland was methodical and calculated. On his way, Cortés established contact with the Totonacs and the Tlaxcaltecs, historical enemies of the Mexicas. Through diplomacy and threat, he managed to seal crucial alliances. The Tlaxcaltecs, who had resisted Tenochtitlan's power for decades, saw in the newcomers an opportunity for revenge. Thousands of their warriors joined the Spanish contingent, transforming a force of barely 500 men into an invasion army. On November 8, 1519, Cortés and his allies entered Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma received them with honor, offering them lodging in the palace of Axayacatl, his father. Chroniclers described the capital as a prodigious city built on Lake Texcoco, with causeways connecting it to the mainland and canals where canoes loaded with flowers, food, and merchandise circulated. The Spaniards were dazzled by its grandeur, but beneath the apparent cordiality, both sides distrusted each other. Shortly after their arrival, Cortés took Moctezuma prisoner under the pretext of maintaining peace. For months he ruled the city through the captive emperor while sending explorers to the provinces to consolidate his dominion. Tension was rising. In the spring of 1520, Cortés learned that Pánfilo de Narváez, sent by Governor Velázquez of Cuba, had landed in Veracruz with orders to arrest him. He left Tenochtitlan with part of his army to confront him. He defeated Narváez and absorbed his men, but in his absence, disaster erupted. Captain Pedro de Alvarado, left in command, had ordered a massacre during a religious ceremony in the Templo Mayor, provoking a general uprising. When Cortés returned, he found the city at war. The Aztecs besieged the Spaniards in the palace of Axayacatl. Moctezuma, attempting to mediate, was stoned by his own people and died shortly after, although the accounts of his death differ. The situation was unsustainable. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards tried to flee under the rain, carrying the gold they had looted. They were discovered and pursued by Mexica warriors. Hundreds died drowned or pierced by spears on the collapsed bridges. That day would go down in history as the sad night. Cortés managed to escape with a few men and take refuge in Tlaxcala, where he reorganized his army. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs chose Cuitláhuac as their new emperor, who successfully resisted the first Spanish attacks, but died shortly after, a victim of smallpox, a disease unknown brought by the Europeans. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, was barely 20 years old when he assumed command of the empire. Despite his youth, he showed remarkable courage and intelligence. He prepared the defense of the capital with ingenuity, fortified the access points, and reorganized his troops. But the city was already besieged by an enemy more relentless than weapons, the epidemic. In May 1521, Cortés began the final siege. With the help of carpenters and sailors, he built 13 brigantines, small warships, to dominate the lake and cut off supplies. The combined forces of Spaniards and Tlaxcaltecas advanced along the causeways, systematically destroying the Mexica defenses. The fight was fierce. Every street, every temple, and every canal became a battlefield. The Aztecs fought to the last man, while hunger and disease decimated the population. Chroniclers' accounts speak of corpses piled in the canals and the air heavy with smoke and ash. For more than 3 months, Tenochtitlan resisted. Cortés offered surrender several times, but Cuauhtémoc refused. On August 13th, 1521, exhausted and without food, the young emperor tried to flee in a canoe, but he was captured. When presented to Cortés, he uttered the words that were etched into the memory of the conquest. "I have done all that was my duty and my kingdom's to defend myself. I can do no more. Take this dagger and kill me with your own hands." Cortés, impressed, spared his life. But the empire had disappeared. Tenochtitlan was razed. The pyramids were destroyed, the temples dismantled stone by stone, and the canals filled to make way for streets and squares. On the ruins of the great Aztec capital, Mexico Tenochtitlan rose, capital of the viceroyalty of New Spain. The lake began to dry, customs were banned, and the gods replaced by saints and crucifixes. The survivors were distributed among encomiendas, forced to work for the new Spanish lords. Cortés, now governor, sent reports to King Charles I describing the magnitude of his conquest and justifying his actions as an evangelization enterprise. But after the glory came distrust. The crown reduced his power, fearing that the conqueror would become too powerful. In 1528 he returned to Spain and was received with honors, although he never regained the same control over the lands he had conquered. His feat, however, was already irreversible. The ancient world of the Mexica had disappeared forever, and on its ruins rose a new mestizo civilization born from blood, iron, and faith. The conquest of the Inca Empire. In the heart of the Andes, the Tahuantinsuyo, better known as the Inca Empire, stretched from present-day Ecuador to northern Chile and Argentina. It was a world of mountains and terraces, of roads crossing chasms, and of temples bathed in gold. Governed from Cuzco, its sacred capital, the empire had reached a political and administrative sophistication unprecedented in the Americas. But when the men of Francisco Pizarro arrived on its coasts in 1532, the unity of the empire was wounded. A civil war between the brothers Huáscar and Atahualpa had torn its internal structure and left its army weakened. The fate of the Tahuantinsuyo was already sealed before the first musket shot was fired. The seed of ruin had been sown years earlier. The great emperor Huayna Capac, son of Tupac Yupanqui, had expanded Inca rule to Quito and consolidated a network of roads, fortifications, and administrative centers that maintained cohesion in that vast territory. But in 1527, while in the north, an unknown epidemic, probably smallpox brought by the Europeans, reached him. He died in Quito alongside his designated heir Ninan Cuyuchi. Without a clear successor, the empire was divided between his two sons, Huáscar, who ruled from Cuzco, and Atahualpa, who controlled the northern provinces. The rivalry degenerated into a bloody war. After years of fighting, Atahualpa emerged victorious, but his triumph came just as Pizarro's ships touched land. Francisco Pizarro, a native of Trujillo, Extremadura, had heard the legends of a golden kingdom during his years in Panama. Poor, illiterate, and tenacious in character, he had participated in Vasco Núñez de Balboa's expeditions and survived jungles, mutinies, and storms. In 1529, he obtained from King Charles I the Toledo Capitulation, granting him the right to conquer and govern the southern lands. With barely 180 men, 27 horses, and a handful of muskets, he set sail south in search of that legendary empire. His small army included decisive figures such as Diego de Almagro and the priest Vicente de Valverde. In November 1532, Pizarro arrived in Cajamarca, a city in the northern Peruvian highlands. There was Atahualpa, who had set up his camp with an army of tens of thousands of soldiers. The Inca, confident in his power, agreed to meet with the foreigners. According to the chronicles, he went out to meet them accompanied by his court, adorned with gold and feathers, while the Spaniards hid around the plaza. Friar Valverde went forward with a crucifix and a Bible, asking him to accept the Christian faith and submit to the King of Spain. Atahualpa, irritated, threw the book to the ground. That was the signal. Pizarro ordered an attack. The cannons thundered, the horses burst through the crowd, and the sound of metal echoed against the stone walls. Thousands of Incas were massacred in a matter of hours. Atahualpa was captured while his generals were scattered. The conquistador understood that, with the emperor in his power, he held the heart of the empire. He kept him prisoner in a palace and forced him to govern through his captivity. Atahualpa, desperate for his freedom, offered to fill a room with gold and silver as far as a man's hand could reach. For months, the temples and sanctuaries of the empire were stripped of their treasures to fulfill his promise. But once the ransom was delivered, Pizarro betrayed him. On July 26, 1533, Atahualpa was executed in Cajamarca. Before dying, he accepted Christian baptism to avoid being burned alive and was strangled with a rope. His death marked the symbolic end of the Tahuantinsuyo. The conquistadors marched toward Cuzco, the imperial capital, where the golden temples were looted and the idols destroyed. The Incas, paralyzed by confusion and lack of leadership, could barely resist. In November 1533, Pizarro entered the city without facing a decisive battle. There, he crowned a puppet Inca, Manco Inca, intending to legitimize his rule. However, the young monarch soon realized he was only an instrument, and in 1536 he rebelled. The Great Rebellion of Cuzco was the Incas' last attempt to restore their empire. Manco Inca gathered an army of tens of thousands of warriors and besieged the city for months. The Spaniards resisted in temples converted into fortresses, firing arquebuses and cannons against the sacred walls. Chronicles describe rains of flaming arrows and the constant sound of war drums, but firearms, horses, and indigenous alliances once again sealed the outcome. Manco was defeated and fled to the Vilcabamba jungle, where he established an independent kingdom that survived for almost 40 years. Meanwhile, Pizarro consolidated his power. In 1535, he founded the city of Lima, called the City of Kings, which soon became the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. But ambition, which had been his strength, would also be his downfall. Disputes with his partner Diego de Almagro became bloody. Both claimed governance of the new lands. In 1538, Almagro was captured and executed by Pizarro's order, igniting a cycle of vengeance. 3 years later, on June 26, 1541, a group of Almagristas broke into the conquistador's house in Lima and stabbed him to death. He died bleeding, drawing a cross with his own fingers on the floor. The Tahuantinsuyo was transformed into a vice-royalty under the authority of the Spanish crown. The temples were replaced by churches, quipus were banned, and native languages were suppressed in favor of Spanish. The gold and silver extracted from the mines of Potosi and Huancavelica fueled Spain's power for over a century. The communal organization of the Ayllu was destroyed by the encomienda system, and the roads of the Capacñan became colonial routes serving imperial trade. In the mountains of Vilcabamba, Manco Inca's descendants maintained their resistance until 1572, when Tupac Amaru Prat, the last Inca sovereign, was captured and beheaded in Cuzco. His death definitively ended the imperial dynasty that had ruled the Andes for over 3 centuries. The echo of the sacred drums faded under the ringing of colonial bells, and the sun temples became cathedrals. The Empire of the Sun had disappeared, and over its ruins the dominion of gold and the cross was born. Weapons, horses, and diseases. When the peoples of the Americas first saw the European conquerors, they did not face just a handful of men, but an unknown war system. On the ships that crossed the Atlantic traveled technologies, animals, and microorganisms that would forever transform the history of the continent. Steel swords, arquebuses, gunpowder, horses, and above all diseases became weapons as decisive as strategy or courage. The military superiority of the invaders did not lie solely in physical strength, but in the difference of worlds that separated them. In Europe, war had evolved over centuries under the weight of metallurgy and engineering. The Castilian armies of the 16th century had Toledo steel swords, resistant and flexible, forged with a technique that combined iron and carbon in alternating layers. The conquerors carried armor, helmets, and metal shields, capable of withstanding the stone or wooden weapons used by the American peoples. Added to this were crossbows and arquebuses, early firearms that, although slow and inaccurate, produced a devastating effect. The noise, smoke, and fire sowed panic among enemies who had never heard a shot. In contrast, indigenous warriors fought with courage and organization, but with rudimentary weaponry. In the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs used the macuahuitl, a wooden sword with obsidian edges capable of precise cutting, but it splintered on the first blow against metal. In the Andes, the Incas used slings, spears, and clubs, effective in hand-to-hand combat but useless against Spanish artillery. Their pressed cotton armor, although light, could not stop blades or bullets. However, it was not only technology that tipped the scales, but the way war was waged. Europeans were accustomed to total violence. Medieval war was based on destruction and the definitive conquest of the enemy. In contrast, many American societies conceived war as a ritual act. Among the Aztecs, for example, the Flower Wars sought to capture prisoners for sacrifice, not annihilate the opponent. This conceptual difference was fatal. The conquerors offered no truces nor respected temples or sacred hierarchies. They attacked to subdue and destroy. Tactical surprise, the use of terror, and the public execution of local leaders broke the morale of entire peoples. But no technological innovation caused greater astonishment than the presence of the horse. Extinct in America for millennia, its reappearance with the Spaniards had an incalculable psychological impact. The indigenous saw in that animal a mythological being, a fusion of man and beast. The riders seemed supernatural creatures capable of piercing crowds with spears and swords. Horses offered speed, height, and strength, advantages unknown on a continent where war was always fought on foot. In open fields, their appearance could decide a battle in seconds. The conquerors used them not only as weapons, but also as symbols of power. In their campaigns, Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro cared more for their horses than for many of their men. They were valuable, scarce, and hard to replace animals. Each one was identified by name and character. Some became legendary, like the horse Marcos, which Cortés rode in Tenochtitlan, or Sultan Pizarro's mount. The indigenous people soon learned to distinguish them and attack them first, but at first the fear was absolute. Chronicles recount that Mexican warriors believed that the horse and rider shared a single soul. As the conquest progressed, horses multiplied on the plains and adapted to the new continent. Within a few decades, the indigenous peoples of the North and South would learn to tame them and make them part of their culture, even transforming their way of life. But during the first years of the conquest, the horse was the emblem of European power, the image of domination. Even so, neither steel nor cavalry were the most decisive weapons of the encounter. It was something invisible, the viruses and bacteria that Europeans unknowingly brought with them. In the bodies of the conquerors traveled diseases against which the American peoples had no defense. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and bubonic plague spread with brutal speed, even preceding the armies. In some cases, the epidemic arrived before the troops. Smallpox was the deadliest. In 1520, an infected African slave disembarked in Mexico with the expedition of Pánfilo de Narváez. Within weeks, the disease spread throughout the valley, reaching Tenochtitlan in the middle of the siege. Bodies were covered with sores, fever consumed them, and panic disorganized the defenses. Thousands died, including Emperor Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's successor. The epidemic did in months what cannons had not achieved in years. Aztec chroniclers recounted how the streets were covered with corpses and the temples empty of priests. In the south, the impact was equal or greater. Before Pizarro reached Cajamarca, smallpox had already reached the Andes, probably transported by merchants or messengers from Central America. The epidemic killed Emperor Huayna Capac and his heir, triggering the civil war that weakened the empire just before the Spanish invasion. In a matter of decades, the indigenous population of America fell from about 60 million to less than 10. The mountains, valleys, and jungles were filled with deserted villages. Europeans believed it was a divine sign that legitimized their conquest. In addition to smallpox, other diseases followed their devastating course. Measles wiped out entire communities, influenza spread along the trade routes of the Caribbean, and malaria came from Africa with slave ships. In many places, Europeans found depopulated regions with no need to fight battles. What for the conquerors was providence or divine intervention, for the native peoples was the end of the world. Paradoxically, the exchange was not one way. From America came illnesses to Europe, such as syphilis, which spread across the continent at the end of the 15th century. But the imbalance was enormous. While Europeans adapted to new diseases, indigenous populations were decimated with no chance of recovery. To the military war was added an unconscious biological war, which changed the continent's demography, economy, and culture. The conquerors' triumph was not only due to the strength of their weapons or the cunning of their leaders, it was the result of an unequal clash between two worlds, one hardened by centuries of wars, plague, and metallurgy, and the other isolated, spiritual and agricultural. Gunpowder, the horse, and smallpox were the three pillars of a dominion that transformed universal history. The conquest of America was not a single war, but a succession of cataclysms, biological, cultural, and moral. The price of that encounter was the collapse of entire civilizations, erased not so much by steel, but by the invisible breath of Europe. The role of the Church and missionaries. After the military conquest came a more silent, deeper, and lasting conquest, that of the soul. From the first landings in the Caribbean, the Catholic monarchs had made it clear that the expansion of their empire had to be accompanied by the spread of Christianity. Each new expedition was, officially, a spiritual enterprise, a crusade intended to save the souls of newly discovered peoples. But beneath that sacred mission also hid the ideological instrument that would justify centuries of domination. Crosses waved on the banners of the caravels. Behind each soldier marched a priest. The process began almost immediately after Columbus's voyages. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the Alexandrine Bulls, which granted the monarchs of Castile and Aragon dominion over the lands of the New World, on the condition of evangelizing their inhabitants. Thus was born the royal patronage, an agreement that granted the crown control over religious organization in America. Church and state intertwined in a single mission: to convert and govern. In the first decades of the 16th century, while the conquerors expanded their territorial control, religious orders also arrived. Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and later Jesuits spread throughout the new territories, founding churches, convents, and missions. Their work combined the teaching of the faith with the total reorganization of indigenous life. Missionaries learned local languages, translated catechisms, and destroyed pagan temples to erect crosses and altars on them. In the ruins of Maya, Aztec, or Inca ceremonial centers, cathedrals were built. Stones from the ancient temples were reused in the walls of the new ones. The process of evangelization was as complex as it was contradictory. Some religious saw their work as an enterprise of love and redemption. Others understood it as a violent imposition of divine order. Native peoples were forced to attend Mass, to be baptized, and to abandon their gods. Images and idols were destroyed or buried. The ancient indigenous priests, bearers of millenary wisdom, were persecuted, tortured, or executed as heretics. In the eyes of Europe, America had to be purified of paganism, even at the cost of erasing its memory. However, there were missionaries who became voices of conscience. The most famous was Friar Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican born in Seville in 1484, who had arrived in America as an encomendero and ended up becoming its fiercest critic. After witnessing the cruelty of the colonists in Hispaniola and Cuba, he renounced his privileges and devoted his life to defending the rights of the indigenous people. In his work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, written in 1552, he denounced the abuses, massacres, and slavery to which the natives were subjected. His words spread across Europe and sparked an unprecedented moral debate. Casas argued that the indigenous people were rational beings, capable of receiving faith without violence. His voice influenced the enactment of the new laws of 1542, which attempted, although not fully successfully, to limit the power of the encomenderos. The tension between evangelization and exploitation defined the spiritual face of the continent. While some religious preached compassion, others accompanied military campaigns, blessing the weapons and legitimizing wars of conquest as just wars. Religion became the language of power. Baptism equaled political submission, and new cities were born under the invocation of saints: San Juan de Ulúa, Santiago de Guatemala, Santa Fe de Bogotá, Lima de los Reyes. The American map was filled with Christian names, replacing ancestral geography with a European spiritual cartography. The missions were one of the most effective mechanisms of control. The friars gathered scattered indigenous people into reductions or towns organized according to a Christian model: church at the center, main square, and aligned houses. There, doctrine, agricultural work, music, and obedience were taught. This model allowed the crown to administer large populations with few resources. Religious orders acted as intermediaries between the indigenous people and royal officials, creating a paternalistic structure that would persist for centuries. In regions such as Paraguay, the Jesuits built authentic theocratic cities where faith and discipline merged into a communal life governed by the sound of bells, but Christianization was neither complete nor homogeneous. In many places, indigenous faith survived hidden under Christian symbols. Virgins, saints, and processions absorbed ancient meanings. In Mexico, the appearance of the Virgin of Guadalupe in 1531 on the hill of Tepeyac, an ancient sanctuary of the goddess Tonantzin, symbolized this fusion of worlds. American Catholicism became a mosaic of syncretisms, a balance between obedience and memory, between the cross and the earth. In the Andes, peasants continued to worship Pachamama, Mother Earth, in the form of local saints. In the Caribbean, African gods brought by slaves merged with Catholic images, giving rise to mixed religions such as Vodou and Santeria. The church was not only a spiritual instrument, it was also an economic and political institution. It accumulated lands, founded universities, and controlled education. In the following centuries, its orders became the main landowners of the continent. Monasteries, estates, and colleges formed a network of power that competed with viceroys and governors. From the pulpits, the moral norms of colonial society were dictated, and from the chairs, the minds of the Creole elites were shaped. Nevertheless, the tensions between the evangelical ideal and the colonial reality never disappeared. The same missionaries who defended the indigenous were at times participants in the system that oppressed them. Baptism was mandatory, forced labor was justified as redemption, and the Spanish language was imposed in the name of divine understanding. Christianity arrived on the continent wrapped in promises of salvation, but also in chains of obedience. By the mid-16th century, America was already a vast spiritual laboratory. Cathedrals rose above destroyed pyramids, monks translated the catechism into Nahuatl, Quechua, or Guarani. Indigenous choirs sang masses in Latin. In the plazas, the conquerors swore by the cross, and the defeated prayed before it. What had begun as a military enterprise transformed into a cultural and religious revolution of planetary scope. The sword had opened the way, the cross took care of sealing it forever. Indigenous resistance. The conquest was not an instant act nor an absolute triumph. Behind the chronicles glorified by the victors, there were centuries of resistance, rebellions, and silent wars that spread across the continent from the Caribbean to the Andes. Although the Aztec and Inca empires had fallen, the spirit of the indigenous peoples didn't extinguish. Beneath the surface of Spanish rule, a constant struggle for survival, dignity, and memory persisted. It was a prolonged war, without precise borders, fought with spears, words, and beliefs. From the first years of colonization, rebellions became a repeated echo. In the Caribbean islands where the conquest began, the Taino peoples were the first to resist. In 1511, the chief Hatue, who had fled from Hispaniola to Cuba, led a revolt against the Spaniards. He warned his followers that the Europeans worshipped gold as a god and urged them to resist. The rebellion was crushed and Hatue was captured and sentenced to the stake. Before dying, a priest offered him baptism to save his soul. Hatue asked if the Spaniards were in heaven. When the friar answered yes, the chief replied that he preferred hell. His response became a symbol of the first American resistance. On the continent, rebellions took diverse forms. Some were open and violent, others slow and hidden. In Mexico, after the fall of Tenochtitlan, numerous peoples tried to regain their independence. Between 1522 and 1525, uprisings broke out in Michoacán, Colima, and Jalisco, where the Purépecha and Otomi peoples attacked Spanish garrisons. In the region of the Mixtecos and Zapotecs, the mountains became a refuge for rebels. Cortés had to send troops to suppress the centers of insurrection that threatened fragile colonial control. Further south, in the jungles and highlands of Guatemala, resistance lasted for decades. The Quiché and Kaqchikel peoples, who had been enemies of the Aztecs, now faced Pedro de Alvarado. After the initial defeat of the Quiché in 1524 and the death of their leader Tecunuman, the mountains filled with insurgents. The Spaniards founded the city of Santiago de los Caballeros to control the region, but the rebellions continued. The Itza Maya, taking refuge in the jungles of Petén, maintained their independence for more than a century and a half. Their capital, Tayasal, resisted until 1697, when it finally fell to a Spanish army coming from Yucatan. It was the last free indigenous city on the entire continent. On the Andean highlands, resistance took on an almost epic dimension. After the execution of Atahualpa and the fall of Cusco, the Spaniards believed they had destroyed the Inca Empire. But in 1536, Manco Inca, the puppet monarch installed by Pizarro, rebelled. He gathered tens of thousands of warriors and besieged the capital for months. Chronicles recount that the hills of Cusco burned at night and that the walls of Coricancha trembled under the roar of the drums. Although the uprising was suppressed, Manco managed to flee to the Vilcabamba jungle, where he founded a new Inca state, clandestine and rebellious. From there, his descendants, Sairi Tupac, Titu Cusi Yupanqui, and Tupac Amaru I, kept the resistance alive for almost 40 years. It would not be until 1572, under Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, that the last Inca was captured and executed in Cusco. With his death, the echo of the empire seemed to vanish, although its memory continued to beat in the Andes. Not all resistances were armed. In many cases, the struggle was fought on a cultural level. The subjugated peoples preserved their languages, rituals, and worldview under the guise of imposed Christianity. The ancient deities hid behind images of saints. Agricultural festivals were transformed into religious celebrations. In Mexico, the Nahuas venerated the Virgin of Guadalupe with the fervor they had previously dedicated to Tonantzin. In the Andes, Pachamama continued to receive offerings in secret, under the indulgent gaze of some priests. Syncretism became a form of spiritual resistance, a way to survive without disappearing. There were also rebellions that overflowed the colonial era and ignited the flame of independence. In 1560, the chief Juan Santos Atahualpa proclaimed a messianic movement in the central jungle of Peru, claiming to be a descendant of the Incas. His message mixed Christianity and Andean tradition, and his rebellion kept the Spanish authorities at bay for more than 20 years. In 1616, in northern Mexico, the Tepehuanis rose up against the Franciscan missions, destroying them almost completely. In 1641, the Araucanians of Chile, known as Mapuches, defeated the Spanish governor's troops and destroyed all the cities south of the Biobío River. It was the only continental region where the Spanish never achieved total conquest. The Mapuches were an exception throughout the Americas. From the 16th to the 18th century, they resisted successive military campaigns. Their leaders, such as Lautaro, Caupolicán, and Pelantaro, developed tactics adapted to European warfare, even learning to use horses and arquebuses. They signed treaties, attacked forts, and destroyed settlements, maintaining independence recognized even by the Spanish crown. The Arauco frontier, south of Chile, became a living line between two worlds that never fully submitted. Over the centuries, indigenous resistance transformed but never disappeared. In the 18th century, a symbolic descendant of the Inca lineage challenged the empire once again. In 1780, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, known as Tupac Amaru II, led a massive rebellion in southern Peru against colonial abuses. His uprising, which spread across the highlands and northern Argentina, gathered thousands of indigenous people and mestizos demanding justice and the end of tribute payments. The insurrection was brutally suppressed. Tupac Amaru II was dismembered in the plaza of Cusco. But his cry, "I will return and I will be millions," remained etched in history as the promise of a people who never stopped resisting. From the Caribbean islands to the Andean mountains, indigenous resistance took different faces but shared the same purpose: not to disappear. Against steel, the cross, and smallpox, native peoples kept their identity alive in songs, textiles, languages, and legends. Sometimes in war, sometimes in silence. The chronicles of the conquerors tried to write their end. History proved that it never came. The foundation of new cities and viceroyalties. After the conquest came order. Over the smoking ruins of the indigenous empires, the Spanish crown undertook a colossal project: the creation of a new political, economic, and religious architecture that would ensure its dominance over the continent. Iron and fire had opened the way, but the pen and the cross would consolidate the vastest empire Europe had ever known. America was reorganized from the ground up. Cities were planned, tributes were systematized, viceroys replaced conquistadors, and the entire continent was transformed into an extension of the Kingdom of Castile. The founding of the first cities had a dual purpose: to serve as administrative centers and as symbols of authority. The conquistadors did not establish simple camps. They founded cities laid out with a cord, with main squares, churches, town halls, and royal houses. At the heart of each city, there had to be a central square from which civil, military, and ecclesiastical power radiated. The urban model, inspired by the ordinances of Philip II and Renaissance thought, reflected the hierarchical order of the monarchy. The square was the symbol of the king's presence, even if the monarch was thousands of kilometers away. In the north of the continent, Hernán Cortés had built Mexico Tenochtitlan on the ruins of the ancient Aztec capital. Its canals were filled in, its temples demolished and replaced by the Metropolitan Cathedral, the Viceroyal Palace, and government buildings. To the south, Francisco Pizarro founded in 1535 the City of the Kings, now Lima, as the administrative seat of Peru and a base for maritime communications with Spain. In the Caribbean, Santo Domingo consolidated as the first capital of the New World, a center of trade, slave trafficking, and the seat of the first royal audience. In a few years, new cities arose such as Guatemala, Quito, Bogotá, Buenos Aires, Caracas, and Santiago de Chile, each organized according to the same model, a microcosm of imperial power. The conquered territory was divided into large administrative units called viceroyalties, headed by a viceroy who represented the authority of the monarch. The first was the Viceroyalty of New Spain, created in 1535 with its seat in Mexico. It was followed by the Viceroyalty of Peru, established in 1542, covering most of South America. These viceroyalties were true kingdoms within the kingdom. They had their own laws, courts, armies, and fiscal systems, but were subordinate to the Council of the Indies in Seville, which regulated all colonial life. Later, over the centuries, the expansion and difficulty of governing such vast territories forced the crown to create new viceroyalties, the Rio de la Plata in 1776 and New Granada in 1717. The viceregal system was key to imperial stability. Viceroys, chosen from trusted nobles, were simultaneously administrators, judges, and military officers. They represented the king in official acts, promulgated laws, and supervised the observance of the Catholic faith. Under them operated the town councils, that is, local governments, and the audiences, which acted as appellate courts. In practice, these bodies formed a bureaucratic network that maintained order and ensured the flow of wealth to Spain. Every ship departing from the port of Veracruz or Callao carried not only precious metals, but also reports, censuses, orders, and decrees that connected the New World with the metropolis. In this administrative framework, the conquistadors were gradually displaced. The crown, fearing their growing power, replaced them with loyal officials and a new elite of Creoles, as the descendants of Spaniards born in America were known, who soon occupied mid-level government positions. The personal dream of glory gave way to institutional obedience. Old rivalries between captains turned into legal disputes, and swords gave way to seals and parchments. The empire became bureaucratic, regulated, and predictable, although on its surface the gold of the cathedrals continued to shine. The church accompanied this process from the beginning. Each new city included a cathedral, a convent, and a hospital, and each region was assigned to a diocese. Evangelization, now organized, was integrated into the political apparatus. Religious missions, especially those of the Jesuits, extended the frontier of the Hispanic world into regions not yet conquered. In the plains of Paraguay, in the Chaco, in the Sonora Desert, or in Upper California, the friars founded self-sufficient towns, teaching agriculture, music, and carpentry to the native peoples. These enclaves were, at the same time, spiritual sanctuaries and advanced posts of the empire. Urban growth brought with it a new social stratification. At the top were the peninsulares, that is, Spaniards born in Europe, followed by the criollos who, although wealthy and cultured, were excluded from the highest offices. Below them were the mestizos, the product of mixing between Europeans and indigenous people, the indigenous people forced to work under the encomienda system, and finally the African slaves who began to arrive in large numbers from the 16th century onward. Each city reflected, in its physical layout and hierarchies, the racial and economic order imposed by the colonial system. White mansions were erected around the square, the indigenous huts spread along the margins. The development of the new cities transformed the landscape. Inca roads became trade routes. Aztec canals became straight avenues. Universities, printing presses, government palaces, and markets were built. Mexico and Lima became centers of power, as imposing as many European capitals. From them, a territory spanning jungles, deserts, valleys, and mountain ranges was controlled. At its peak, the Spanish Empire seemed eternal, a machine of power so vast that no enemy could challenge it. But the balance was fragile. The wealth flowing to Seville and Madrid depended on an extraction system that impoverished the colonies and exhausted their human resources. Indigenous peoples were reduced, mines demanded more labor, and lands were monopolized by large landowners. The cities, although monumental, were also centers of inequality. The distance between peninsulares and criollos grew. Between the palace and the hut, the abyss widened. However, during the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish power reached its zenith. From the Andes to the Caribbean, the viceroys governed in the name of a distant monarch, and the bells of the cathedrals rang like echoes of the metropolis. The colonial order seemed firm, immutable, protected by faith and the sword. The flags of Castile waved over both oceans, and the American cities, born of conquest, shone like mirrors of European power in the New World.